Hi, this is more movie therapy, and I'm going to delve into the movie First Night, Daddy's Little Girls. And in these videos, I often analyze romance and marriage failures and their knock-on effects on the children of those marriages. These next two videos are about movie stories that don't directly relate to my own personal life, but they are my insights and ideas about these two movies' possible psychological meanings that may resonate with you and arouse your feelings and ideas. When you watch something you identify with it in some way, it might be a clue to some part of your personal story. We used to call this your inner monologue when I was in acting class, and we would try to be thinking about what the character's inner monologue was as sort of a basis for when we would play the scenes. And watching these movies, if you have a response to them, it might help you to understand your life journey better, or understand your partner's feelings or actions better, put them in context and not take them the wrong way. My interpretations are just meant to show ways to delve into the meaning of movies and their symbols and things and how to interpret them. Every story means something particular to each person who reacts to it. And please don't think I'm trying to be superior to anybody. My marriage was a disaster. I have said in the past that it was a lie, but that's not exactly right. It was worse than a lie. It was a half-truth. My husband held out the elusive goal of his happiness as the carrot to keep my son and I from expecting very much from him. As I point out in my book, Bedeviled, eventually he was incapable of any kind of sustained engagement in our lives. And he was a ghost in his own life, hardly there at all most of the time. Watching movies has helped me to understand what happened to me and my son and my husband. Movies are a way to experience the emotions and story logic of how these personality problems might play out in real life. It's a way to begin to put together your own story and the story of your partner and the story of your relationship. Everything you respond to in culture gives you a clue to what you're feeling, and then you have to ask why you feel that. My family often did things that hurt all of us due to some misguided emotional interpretation of what they thought was happening. I love them, but at the same time, it's been very important to me to be objective about what some of their storylines might be and help understand where those bad outcomes of those stories came from. I call this process movie therapy. That's what it's been for me. Movie therapy has allowed me to understand and forgive and move on in a better, less angry and confused way. So on with the show. My initial interest in this film, First Night, was simply for my movie therapy, and I got interested in it when my mother's younger sister had passionately urged me to be sure and watch this movie. I had a feeling it was very important to her and would tell me something about her life. This happened many years ago in the course of a long conversation with my aunt, that younger sister. She was the one who had sympathized with my grandfather in the marital discord between my grandparents, as I mentioned in the longer Phantom of the Opera video. My mother, who was the middle daughter, was the captive, really, of my grandmother's side of the story. I don't think it really was a voluntary captivity. But my aunt took my grandfather's side. She was always sticking up for him. And she and I had discussed my mother and my grandmother and our family history. Then, moving on to lighter topics, we talked about movies and acting, and these were two passions that we both shared. In the course of this conversation, she very eagerly and enthusiastically insisted that I must be sure and see First Night. And when my aunt was enthusiastic, there was no resisting her. I looked the film up, and once I saw the plot, I recognized why this movie might mean so much to her, why it was so important to her that I see this movie. Of course, we're all familiar with the story of Camelot. Guinevere marries King Arthur, who is the embodiment of light versus darkness, the bringer of peace, justice, and stability. Then Guinevere falls in love with the young, gallant, and handsome Sir Lancelot. In this movie version, King Arthur is played by an older Sean Connery, and Sir Lancelot is played by a very young, winning Richard Gere, with a young Julia Ormond playing Guinevere. Here I could see an emotional reenactment of my aunt's youth and her relationship to her father, my grandfather. And I have seen this same love triangle in several other women friends of mine. The story goes like this, very much like the King Arthur story. These young girls see that their father is not respected or treated well by their mother. They sympathize with their father and take his side in disputes with his wife. The browbeaten father gladly accepts their understanding and devotion. However, their devotion comes at a steep price to those girls. Their father's connection to his wife is by definition a sexual connection, and it is that sexual connection that has been his downfall and brought him low in his own and his wife's esteem. His daughter loves and defends him fervently and deeply respects him and admires him. He is, after all, her one and only father. He is her King Arthur. But by reacting against her mother's treatment of her father, she also learns to despise and disparage women's sexuality as the dangerous power that has ruined her father. Her inward resolution is that she will never sink to being that kind of woman. She's far above competing with her mother in a sexual contest, nor does her father want her to compete with her mother in that way. In her childish adoration and devotion to her father, these girls become chaste priestesses of ideals and principles that their father stands for, defending him against their mother's attacks. When these young women eventually leave home to marry, their loyalty and devotion to their father, their king, and all he stands for, remains part of who they are. Their marriage, like the love affair of Guinevere and Lancelot, is sexual to the extent that the young woman is attracted to a young, eligible male who must show traits that her father admires. In addition, she and her husband must be devoted to a cause that is higher than mere sexual attraction. So obviously, these women are often rather chastely dressed, without very much makeup or fancy hairdos. As Guinevere says to King Arthur in this movie, when he has caught her in a passionate embrace with Lancelot, "My will is yours, my lord, but my heart is his." Guinevere and these girls, these daddy's girls, remain the high priestess for their father figure, but they have brought a younger male into the cult. And what kind of Lancelot wants a woman who has renounced overt sexuality? Probably the kind of man who is very taken with himself and his skills and achievements. That kind of man is often repelled or threatened by female sexiness, or threatened by the idea that it takes the focus off their own perfections. They even may be a little insecure. They focus on trying to be perfect all the time and don't have time, and maybe are even a little offended by a woman trying to come on to them and be sexy. But this works out perfectly because Lancelot remains loyal to his priestess and happily is never tempted by the women who pursue him just for his manly perfection. He and Guinevere have a higher cause that they're pursuing, saving the Knights of the Round Table. And he and Guinevere share a contempt for female sexiness in all its forms. Now you may think I'm reaching with a lot of this, but look at the title, First Night. Yes, and try spelling it this way, First Night, N-I-G-H-T. In this Camelot version, Guinevere does not get to consummate her marriage with King Arthur. After her passionate kiss with Lancelot, we assume that she will in fact spend her first night with the first knight of the realm, now that the king is dead. And no matter what I think of the Lancelot and Guinevere type marriage, this movie helped me see that it wasn't a total failure as a marriage. Guinevere does give up Arthur for her young lover and protege, and he does take over and help her carry on the precious values of her father. She becomes a devoted priestess of a man who probably needs that kind of total approval. Before I end this, I must confess I watched this movie expecting to find it a silly, condescending effort by Hollywood to make a movie for the romance crowd. I didn't think it was going to be worthy of serious consideration outside the psychological insights that the basic story suggests. How wrong I was. It's an excellent movie. In many ways, it's very well done, although clearly most of the money went into paying star salaries. As my son pointed out, a lot of the location scenes look like Sean Connery wandered into a Renaissance festival. But before watching this movie, I had a cocktail to put myself in a more receptive mood, and it worked. I parked my jaded Hollywood self in the back seat and settled down to enjoy the show. And to my great surprise, I was captivated and enchanted by the film. What I loved was the romantic atmosphere of the King Arthur story, which of course has been a beloved story for centuries. They did a good job of evoking ancient England without going overboard and making it all about the costumes and the scenery. The picture was evocative rather than historically perfect. It managed to call back to mind an early childhood memory of mine. I used to read Prince Valiant in the comic section. And rather than snickering at the silliness of this movie trying to evoke the romance of the Arthurian saga and chivalry, I really enjoyed going there again and indulging in romantic fantasy. I know everybody thinks we baby boomers grew up in the lap of luxury. No. Many, if not most of us, grew up in brand spanking new cookie-cutter suburban developments paid for by the GI Bill. My development town had the charmingly romantic name of Rock Hill. It had been a cow pasture near a gigantic lime quarry before a huge housing development of 2-bedroom family homes was built there. There were no trees. It was virtually a flat landscape with rows and rows of homes circling around blazing hot white cement roads, which baked in the sweltering heat of summer in Missouri and were lashed by rainstorms and blizzards in winter. Rock Hill sounds like a prison, doesn't it? Yeah, Prince Valiant roving in the green swards of King Arthur's England was especially enchanting in barren Rock Hill. If you long for a taste of romance and loveliness, of bygone honor and noble sentiments, don't miss this charming movie. I also want to stress that my interpretation of this movie and what it meant to me is just one possible interpretation. My son really enjoyed it too, and obviously for different reasons than my aunt did. He saw it as King Arthur representing justice and peace, and who is an inspiration to the wild and formidable young Lancelot, and King Arthur enlists him in the great cause of becoming one of the stalwart knights of the Round Table, passing on the torch of that glorious tradition. My next video will be about the movie Lovely Bones. Now, this movie is based on a best-selling book that was published in 2002. The movie was made in 2009. The book and the movie appear to be a murder mystery about a young woman on the verge of puberty who is raped and then murdered and never found. The story is told by the young girl victim as she looks down from heaven. And that may be what others see in this obvious and intended plot, but the emotional storyline that I see is quite different and relates very closely to First Night. My interpretation of the Arthur-Guinevere-Lancelot triangle is the love triangle that sets the stage for the emotional conflicts in Lovely Bones. I know it sounds weird, but there it is. I think you'll be interested. What this movie seems to me to be about is what happens to the girl children or the girl child of a marriage like the Camelot marriage. This is more movie therapy. These daddy's girls and their unbalanced marriages can have devastating consequences on their children. And I will discuss this in my next movie therapy video called Lovely Bones, Sins of the Flesh. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this, and thank you for listening.